Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this video is a little different. I'm going to be giving you a quick tour of my Aeldari collection and then talking a bit about how I got into the hobby, as well as what it means to transition from exclusively casual play to being the kind of Autarch who can enjoy a variety of opponents, both casual and competitive. Several of you have been asking for this for a while, and I put it off because it seemed embarrassingly self-indulgent to make a video showing off my collection and talking about how I got started, but a couple of comments on the Farseer's report finally pushed me over the edge. Also, I kind of figured that because I put out 2 tactics videos within the last week, I can probably get away with it. So here we go. I'll start with a few shots of the collection, minus the Drakari, which wouldn't fit on the table. And I mostly keep the Drakari around as servants of your brain anyway, so they don't see a ton of mono play. This is about 20,000 points of Space Elves painted as Craftworld Ibersil and Soaring Spite Harlequins. Every unit in the Codex is represented, and although not all the Forge World options are here, it's generally sufficient to put together any list I might want to run for either narrative or competitive purposes. Here we have the backbone of Guardians and Guardian-driven armored vehicles that are the core of every Craftworld's Warhost. The paint scheme was developed by Striking Scorpion 82. You can find his tutorial with a Google search. The magic ingredient is Sotek Green with a Nightshade wash and Bahareth Blue edge highlighting. The scheme is really easy to pull off, although one of my patrons on Discord has also figured out how to get basically the same effect with Pterodon Turquoise contrast paint, which is even easier. So if you become a patron and sign up for the Discord, you can find out more about that. But it's pretty straightforward. Here's the Wraithguard contingent for when circumstances are especially desperate and we have to ask Grandma to come out of retirement for one last brawl. Most of what you see here is magnetized, including 10 of the infantry that I blessedly found magnetized and unpainted on eBay at MSRP. I have never magnetized an infantry model in my life, despite some of you trying to walk me through it like you were rehabilitating a skittish puppy. I'm just too scared. Here we have the scouts, pirates, corsairs, and other outcast riffraff that shows up when there is something in it for them or they're feeling sentimental about where they came from originally. You probably can't tell, but the big block of 30 Rangers is being led by the Ibersil equivalent of Illic Nightspear. Here we have the aspect shrines, generally 10 to 15 of each, but there are more spears and avengers because those are favorites, and then the banshees come in at almost 30 because, well, Ibersil. I haven't picked up the new scorpions yet, and I do have a box of the current Dark Reapers, which I've built and primed, but I haven't quite gotten to painting them. I also should confess that while most of what is on this table I painted myself, 15 of these banshees and 3 of the spears were painted by Bob Builds Better on Instagram, who does commission jobs. Bob is genuinely a top tier painter whose work makes mine look like the amateur pack job it actually is. He also did my Corsairs, my new avatar, and one of the Phoenix Lords. You're going to be able to tell which one. The Soaring Spite Harlequins were mostly painted by Danilo from Your Painting Lab in Italy. Danilo's work looks great on the table and is enormously affordable. You can find him on Facebook or Instagram. I recommend him highly, especially if you want a large number of models table ready relatively quickly. He's really good. Here's the command staff, including our boy Eldred, and a pretty cool Footseer model with Falchu's wing, modeled with like a, I think, 3rd edition Swooping Hawk Exarch wing set. Hopefully Falchu's wing will come back as an enhancement in the Codex. It's been around for a while as an artifact. I kind of miss it just aesthetically also because of this guy. Here are some Skyrunner Warlocks, Warlock Conclaves led by a Jetbike Seer. I'm really hoping that the new Codex makes these viable as combat units again, especially for you Ulthway players out there. Warlock Conclaves are so cool, currently not terribly usable. Here's the full Phoenix Court. And I bet you can tell which model Bob painted. There is no better illustration of the difference in our skills. Here we have the current avatar and my old Forge World avatar, which I spent weeks painting and was enormously proud of until the one Bob did for me, which makes mine look like an angry toddler demanding a biscuit. And lastly, the Aeldari, which are, by my estimation, some of the most dynamic models in the Aeldari line. Now, I'll cycle through some other pictures of the models on the table, close-ups and stuff as I talk, but from here on, this video is primarily just a listening experience. But I guess if you want to keep gazing at my models, you can. I'll throw in a few other images as well, but mostly it's the collection. My own Warhammer journey started back in the 90s when I was in 6th grade, which is ages 11 and 12 for those of you who did not grow up in the States. And I suspect that most American viewers can agree that 6th grade sort of sucks, which is one of the reasons it's such a great time to delve into the worlds of fantasy and science fiction. Since I was in grade school, I had admired Warhammer models in the local comic shop, but it wasn't until one of my friends swiped some back issues of White Dwarf from his older brother that I became interested in the hobby, as a hobby. These issues of White Dwarf circulated through our friendship group the way cool kids passed around other kinds of magazines, and by the Christmas break, all of us had purchased some models with the tacit understanding that nobody was allowed to collect exactly the same thing as anyone else. Because you needed far fewer models back then to play 40K, like far fewer. I think maybe 800 or 900 points was probably a 2,000 point list in terms of today's points. We all managed to assemble fully painted 2,000 point armies by the last weeks of the school year, and to get together in someone's basement for our first 40K party. At that time, this struck me as a remarkable achievement for a bunch of 12-year-olds. And then we played all through middle school. My middle school meta, this core group, was initially composed of a super religious kid running Ultramarines, a future devotee of the Smashing Pumpkins who played Dark Angels, a punk rock kid who collected both Orcs and Imperial Guard, an edgy rule breaker running Chaos Space Marines alongside Khorne and Demons, and his bestie who kept painting his Space Marines as different chapters until they were pale blobs that he insisted were white scars. And over the course of the next 3 years, we dragged a bunch of other weirdos and misfits in as well, along with, I think, one cool kid, which is weird. I settled on Eldar in part because nobody else gave them a second glance, but also because they were mysterious and elegant and strangely dignified. I had initially been more interested in running Wood Elves and Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but nobody else wanted to play that. So my first blister pack was a couple of 40K models labeled Eldar Heroes, and weirdly consisted of a Ranger model with a pair of needle pistols. Those don't exist anymore, alongside a Metal Guardian with a Shuriken pistol and an Aeldari blade. I also bought paints and brushes because you could still get all that stuff for a single $20 bill in the 90s, and thus my collection began. Aesthetically speaking, it was hideous. I had no natural talent for painting, and at that age, I was allergic to following directions, so I eschewed the wisdom of official painting guides and had to learn everything the hard way. My metal swooping hawks were as patchy as my plastic monopose guardians, and it was only when I finally discovered inks that my rangers started to look weathered and grubby, instead of like deformed beggars in capes. I did have a really nice Rogue Trader era dreadnought with a tiny head, which is apparently so rare that I haven't been able to find a picture of it online anywhere. It did not have the teardrop head. It had eye lenses. It looked vaguely like a satyr in some strange, ineffable way. But it was only nice looking because it was purchased pre-painted from that friend's older brother, who we stole the White Dwarfs from. This older brother had abandoned 40K for dating and death metal. And with neither of those temptations available to me at the tender age of 13, I added some Tyranids as my second army in 7th grade and built a surprisingly not totally crap game table out of a map pirated from the defunct Battle Masters board game in a bunch of repurposed scenery from my father's failed attempt to get me into model trains when I was 8. I bet other people listening to this video pirated one of those Battle Masters maps. I can't be the only one. We also discovered the trick of spray painting styrofoam packing materials such that they partially melted and became passable ruins if you squinted hard enough, especially if you added some broken toothpicks as exposed rebar. I bet I'm not also not the only one who did that. Nevertheless, despite having built this table and whatever else, throughout late middle school and early high school, I was much more interested in playing the game than in the hobby side of things. All of my lists started with a couple of units that I just liked the look of, but I loved obsessing about tactics and synergies. And after a 28 game winning streak with a variety of builds from multiple armies into a variety of opponents, I came to the insane conclusion that I was some sort of 40k Ender Wiggin. In retrospect, I was just the only jerk in my teenage meta who actually thought about winning games while building lists. And at that time, 40k was much more of like an RPG than a tactical war game. So a 28 game winning streak was actually something to be ashamed of. But I didn't figure that out until the second half of high school, when our friendship group was becoming more complex and other interests were pulling me away from the hobby. Nevertheless, I kept up with Warhammer a bit into university. I played a few games here and there, mostly Fantasy Battles and Necromunda, but a little 40k. And then the final blow to my first 40k career came when I agreed to give my friend Dave the majority of my Tyranids if he would strip and repaint my Eldar to look halfway decent. And then we fell out of touch, and the whole of my collection was gone forever, along with slap bracelets, comic cards, and the confidence of youth. Fast forward through a few presidencies, some international catastrophes, and several major life changes for me to the beginning of 8th edition. And here I'm going to plagiarize a little bit from an article I wrote for the website years ago, but there'll also be some new material too. I got back into the hobby when a friend of mine who was a professional distiller traded a case of craft vodka for a bunch of secondhand Eldar and gave them to me as a birthday gift. He really wanted to play 40k, and he was like, I'm gonna make you do it. I was delighted. Although I hadn't played in over 10 years, I immediately found myself listening to lore podcasts and reading Black Library novels and painting models with the enthusiasm of a jubilant pony who has just discovered he's actually a unicorn. I was having a blast. Over the next few months, I built what I thought was a pretty impressive Eldar army. I had a wide variety of models such that I could field several different builds at 2,000 points. My collection had already outgrown what I had as a kid. And any of the armies that I could build really looked like the kind of Aeldari war host that might appear in the official fluff. I imagined that my space elves were more than ready to like pop out of the webway and blast the forces of chaos back into the warp and then be back to the craft world in time for aperitifs and poetry readings. And then I played my first game since university. It was against Thousand Suns and Tzeentch, and I got my ass so thoroughly kicked that by the middle of turn 2, my few remaining space elves were weeping salty, salty tears as they gazed across the field at well over 100 enemy infantry with 4-up invulnerable saves and some big demons to boot. I realized that there was nothing in my collection with the firepower to deal with that volume of durable light infantry. I just couldn't. Nor did I have the counterchargers or robust screening units that could prevent my elves from being butchered in close combat. It was an auto loss no matter what I did. So I bought a bunch of new models and I went back to work. The next time I played this guy, I thought I was ready. I had painted like 30 Guardians, batch pads. I had another 150 hours into the hobby. I was not ready. He brought Magnus the Red, who teleported into my backfield on turn 1, and even after I opened up on him with literally everything in my list for 2 turns, that big red bastard was still alive and wading through my delicately painted aesthetes like Sauron in the opening scene of The Lord of the Rings. It was terrible. And it was after this game that I fell into the trap that so many of us fall into at some point. I decided that the problem was that my opponent was playing Warhammer the wrong way. I was building army lists that were fun and interesting and consistent with the fluff, while he was just trying to game the rules to win matches before they started. The hypocrisy of my outrage, given my behavior as a tween, was lost on me at this point. But to be fair to my teenage self, even that version of me never ran more than one iteration of a super strong unit. And I always started with some units that I just thought were aesthetically cool. But I was still list building with an eye towards winning at that time, and other people weren't doing that. So maybe I had this coming. In any event, I posted about this experience online, and it produced a firestorm of responses, ranging from declarations that not only was I right, but my opponent was clearly some sort of win-at-all-costs subhuman troglodyte who should be forced to eat printed copies of his net lists until he chokes and dies, to accusations that I was a pathetic whiner who needed to stop complaining about an opponent using models available to him and just grow a pair. I was stunned. I had no idea that people had such strong feelings about this sort of thing. I was just like slightly frustrated. This was when I realized that since I was a kid, 40K had evolved into a couple of really distinctly different games, and there was enormous acrimony between people communicating poorly about what kind of experience they were looking for. So I decided to be a more proactive communicator. After the third time I played Thousand Suns Guy, I asked him to run a more casual list the next time, and he said he would. And in our next game, although he did not bring Magnus, Thousand Suns Guy still ran an army that I think probably would easily have finished in the top 2 at a local tournament. He wasn't trying to be a dick. He just, like, when he builds a list, he can't not think about it as a solution to a puzzle. The puzzle being how to win. He's also just a really, really good player who doesn't make many play errors. It took me longer than I would care to admit to realize that there was no problem with how my friend was playing the game. It's just that neither I nor my collection was ready for his level of competitive play, and he didn't share my ineffable, totally intuitive notion of what constitutes a casual list. Telling someone that you want to run casual lists is like telling somebody in the early stages of a romantic relationship that you want to keep things casual. It's a phrase that can mean almost anything and is likely to result in misunderstanding. I think the goal in setting up casual play is to get both players to the table with lists that have reasonable odds of beating one another, such that, like, when the game begins, it's the choices the players make, and to some degree the dice, that determine the outcome of the game. It's not some foregone conclusion. Win or lose, this kind of game is generally fun, and I think it's what most casual players are after. Some of you are already typing comments like, I don't care who wins, I just care about the story. And you know what? That's great. But I do think that even the majority of casual players don't enjoy games as much when none of the decisions that they can make can possibly result in victory. So in some cases, I think that, like, maybe you and the other player just are on the same wavelength and agreeing to run casual lists, and it works. But when this isn't the case, cooperative list building can be helpful. You know, maybe your opponent says, like, I want to run an all melee demon list, so please don't bring an army that will shoot me off the table turn 1. Great. Now you can pull out all your melee aspect warriors and storm guardians that don't get a ton of play. It's also a fun way to, like, build a story around the battle to make it more entertaining. In any event, it's super, I think, important to communicate with your opponent. This is a thing I hope we all know. Before a game, as long as we're both playing the same 40K type of 40K, generally it's fun. And another thing, regardless of whether you tend to prefer casual or competitive Warhammer, there's a lot to be said for learning the other kind of play. Like, it's easy to defensively declare or tell yourself that you just aren't interested in competitive play. That's what I did for a few months when I got started. I even believed it. But I think that if you had even one really fun experience playing the kind of 40K that you're less familiar with, whether it's competitive or narrative, right? There are people who just start off in competitive play and they've never tried a narrative game. They don't really understand what that would look like. If you can have a positive experience playing the kind of 40K that you're not used to, one positive experience, I think it is much easier to be interested in it after. So this declaration that we're not interested in whatever, sometimes is because we don't know how to be, right? I still love narrative and casual 40K, love them. But I also love competitive games now in which both players are assembling the best army that they can and then do their absolute damnedest to outmaneuver one another with strategic play. That's really fun. It is also more demanding. If you just don't have a lot of time or mental energy for the hobby, that's probably not on the table for you. But if you do, it's a really, really fun way to play. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not like morally bankrupt or unvirtuous to play the game that way, as long as both people are doing it. In fact, it was gradually evolving as a player, such that I could enjoy a wider variety of games that led to the creation first of my now tragically neglected website, and then later this YouTube channel. In the second half of 8th edition, when craft worlds were a laughable dumpster fire at the bottom of the meta, and I was working my ass off to learn how to get the most out of them at tournaments, I found myself regularly reaching out to frustrated players on social media to offer advice. Finally, I figured out I could save myself some time by creating a website geared towards helping new Autarchs make the transition from novice play to mid-tier tactical play. And there was a bunch of nice feedback about that. And then after continuing to improve as a player for a couple more years, then I started the website and discovered that the audience had grown to include quite a lot of serious tournament veterans with pretty impressive records, in addition to the like aspiring Autarchs, which has altered the way I think about content creation from the first couple of years, because there's a wider audience now for the material. Also, I obviously grew as a player. Nevertheless, the primary purpose of the channel remains helping fellow Space Elf enthusiasts get more out of the game by reducing the steep learning curve inherent to one of 40K's most complex factions, and also to encourage people to be more open-minded about other kinds of play. And in that sense, I think probably the channel still has the most to offer newer players or less experienced ones. But I've also added content to do with lore and Black Library novels and the history of the hobby, because my own interests have broadened significantly from those of that tween boy who just wanted to be Space Elf Alexander the Great. One of the coolest things about 40K is that it isn't a single hobby. It's a family of potential obsessions, each to do with some different aspects of the whole thing, and each aspect of it has something different to offer. While assembling the collection that I'm showing off in this video, I also built 4 thematic boards, including most notably an elaborate crone world where my Ibrisley space elves can hunt for waystones and artifacts from before the doom. I worked my way through dozens of Black Library novels, mostly audio versions, while painting or driving. And I've played some of the video games, and I've also built a Tyranid army and an Emperor's Children army and Slaanesh demons for those days when I'm just not feeling up to being an Autarch. Most importantly, though, I've connected with a broader community of like-minded people at tournaments, local stores, and also online. Back when I was 25, I never envisioned myself coming back to the hobby later in life. And the 12-year-old boy who got the dog walking job to save up for metal guardians with shuriken catapults that had punk rock haircuts could never have imagined owning a collection of space elves large enough to cover an entire game table. He certainly could not have imagined regularly playing on terrain more elaborate than what was depicted in the issues of White Dwarf that were a form of currency when I was a kid. But I am so glad to have had the opportunity to do those things. The family of hobbies that is 40K has been not only a source of joy and community and creative opportunity these past few years, but it's also been at times an emotional flotation device that's given me something to ponder and look forward to when things are hard, even harder than 6th grade. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking everyone who has listened to this for being part of the community that ultimately is the hobby. I hope some of you will share your own stories and comments below, or link your Instagram accounts, or just leave a note telling us something positive about your own experience with the grim darkness of the 41st millennia. I read and appreciate every comment, even though with a day job and 2 small kids, I can't reply to all of them. As usual, I'll also link my Patreon in the video description for those of you interested in connecting more personally and supporting the content in other ways. Best wishes, many thanks. Until next time, take care.